to another episode of the Guaranteed Analysis. This
Hi,
episode
everyone.
is probably one of my favorites. What do you think, Kim? I love talking about this. Forms of feeding, how to feed your pet.
Huh. No, I don't share that.
Oh, huh. What do
I
you
don't
love to
share
talk
it.
about?
I
What's your fave?
think it's probably one of my least favorite things to talk to owners about. I like clinical
Huh.
stuff. I love
Okay.
explaining how nutrition works in the body to
Mm.
owners. That's my favorite.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I think what gave you joy is like doing a feeding tube demo to a client
oh,
in the room. Yeah.
I could do so many feeding tube demos. I like literally I could be the feeding tube lady in a hospital and just all of them, whether it's NG to like a peg tube. I don't care. I love it.
And you're so good at it, which we got to do that. We got to let you shine in that because you were amazing
Oh
at getting that fear, alleviating that
yeah,
fear in clients, and having them stop think of it like as a terminal end of life,
right.
like it is for
Yeah,
people. With
no.
pets, it's a tool, and so you're really good about that. So we definitely need to do that
Oh yeah.
as an
And my
episode.
my life goal is to get more
Yeah.
veterinarians to put more in.
Oh, please. Yes, absolutely. I think we could do a whole. We will do a whole
We will.
critical care, how to feed critical care patients. We'll have a guest person come in and talk about that's a either criticalist or an ER doctor. But I think we could also do a whole standalone where it's just you and you're like, let's talk about assisted feeding devices to
Oh
pet guardians and also vet nurses and vet techs. I know that's a political issue as to what to call them, but yeah, getting to your point, getting more veterinary professionals comfortable with using assisted feeding devices earlier and
yeah.
stop waiting to the last minute to talk about nutrition overall,
Yeah.
and especially when it comes to devices. Yeah.
Yes.
So I get that. I get why that's a good one. That's a good one. I love talking through what are the different broad categories and options out there
Oh,
for
so
clients
many
and
things
then
now.
letting them pick, right? Because I feel like
Yeah.
it's not my job necessarily always. Sometimes it is my job to tell them what to do if they have a pet with very restrictive nutrients that they need. But
Yeah.
even then, they still have options, right? Even then, they could still
Yeah.
oftentimes do
So
something,
nice.
commercial based versus fresh and homemade. And so it's really my job to talk about the pros and cons of both and then to let them decide because, they have to, their budget factors in and um, there's so many what their pet
Yeah.
likes. There's so many factors. So I really feel like in nutrition, you can't be telling them what to do and not to do.
Yeah, there's just so many options now. Like probably, back in the day, there was like kibble or you just fed your dog scraps. Like,
Yeah. Yep. And
so
so,
many options, which is just so lovely for pet guardians now that
yeah,
so
it's a
great.
double-edged sword, right? It's a duality. It's wonderful
Yeah,
and confusing at the same time.
true.
And
True.
so when I just like zoom way out, like before we really dive in, let's zoom way out and talk about what I consider the categories or of pet food and
Yeah.
feeding. So we have two major categories. So we have our commercial and our fresh. Those are the two main categories. And then we can subcategorize underneath that.
Yeah.
Underneath the kibble, we can have kibble and canned, conventional, science-based. So what that is those are companies that value and formulate to the nutrients and that they believe that the nutrients are the most important thing, maybe the only important thing. And they formulate based on a very evidence-based, needing the data to back everything up that they do. And that is why they do the things the way that they do it. And so within
Mhm.
those companies, that's like Hill's Purina, Royal Canin, those companies. And they get vilified and they shouldn't get vilified. They're doing things that they think are the best for pets based on their philosophies and how they make their diets. Nobody's out there to kill pets. let's
No.
just let's just say that full out. Like nobody's out
And
there to harm
right.
pets. So let's just stop that. Whoever's saying that, stop it.
Right.
They're not.
And how many pets have you seen that have been their lives have been changed by these diets?
Of course.
So
Yep.
many.
Yep.
Like they are doing good work and we can't deny that.
Absolutely. And a lot of the research we have out there is we haven't because of them, and we should
Yes.
thank them for that. Is
Yes.
there also a double-edged sword out there in that there's a whole lot of data they don't share with us? Yeah,
Right.
there
Right.
is. There sure
Yeah.
is. At
Yes.
the same time, though, again, duality, they're running a business. And if it was any other industry, that would be perfectly acceptable and normal. It's that there's proprietary trade secrets that they wouldn't share because that
Right.
would influence how their competitors are able to. So the same applies for pet food. And we'd like to maybe in a perfect world say that all the data would always be shared. It's not. And do
No.
they have a large influence over veterinary medicine in general? Yeah, they do. We should have more non branded nutrition education, more nutrition specialists, more
Mhm.
nutrition services in every single vet and technical school. Yes. So those things are all true, right? So those are all things are true. And so I can see why people may start to perpetuate myths about these companies that aren't true. They're not though. They're full on not true. And so those are in those category. They just have a different philosophy of how they formulate.
Mhm.
And then we can have still within our commercial category, we can have our, I call it ingredient centric. And so rather than being nutrient centric, they're more ingredient centric. I hate the term natural because there's been so much, I call it natural watching. It's like greenwashing in the human
It's
space.
way
We have
too subjective. It means way
natural
too many
washing.
things. It's like too much of a buzzword now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's way too much of a buzzword and it doesn't mean anything.
It
In
really doesn't. It means nothing.
Yes, AFCO, there's loose guidelines where it's basically saying, that it shouldn't have any added chemicals unless it's in a vitamin or mineral. And even then, companies use that term so loose and fast. So really
And it
important to ask the pet guardian, what does that mean to you? You
right,
want a
it's
natural
exactly
pet. What does that mean to you?
what does it mean to them? Like, that's exactly it, is it it means something so different to every single individual person. So, clarifying that is very important.
Really important. So if that is truly, and you ask your pet guardian or you as a pet guardian when you're talking to and communicating with your veterinary professional who's assisting you in maybe choosing a diet, communicate with them. Why do you want to feed or why are you feeding the food you're feeding? What's important to you in a pet food company? And usually that aligns pretty tightly with meeting at their truth and what's
Mhm,
important to us. Like how do we feed ourselves? What nutritional philosophies do we go by? That generally tends to be reflected in how we feed our pets. So if we like a more nutrient forward approach, we may go with more of the conventional science-based companies that also reflect that in their
mhm.
formulations versus if we're looking for more of that ingredient centric, a little more limited ingredient, kind of more natural for ourselves, we may want that reflected
Yeah.
for
Or
our animals.
I personally like a blend of both.
Yeah,
I like the
why
best of both
not? It
worlds.
doesn't have to be black and white, right? It can
Right,
be very
right. There's
gray
that
and in
gray,
the
I like the
middle
gray
and
area of the blend of the 2 where, it's both ingredient centric, so they care about what the ingredients are, but they follow the science and also, what nutrients are important. I like the best of both worlds if I can get
best of both worlds.
it.
Exactly. Precisely. And so within that category, and if that's what people want, awesome. Like we shouldn't be shaming people and being like, you can only feed the big
No.
three. There are
No.
other options out there. There
Yep.
are companies who formulate with more of a nutrient and ingredient, um, and still being a little bit more limited ingredient. And then we could have a whole other episode on processing and what that means because so many lack of definitions and like less processed
Right.
and within that conventional science base, there's pros and cons, right? There's pros and cons
Mhm.
to each and every one of these categories.
Yep.
So when we get into each one, we'll talk about the pros and cons within the options.
Yeah.
And when I present this to veterinary professionals or even clients, I'll often do it in the way that I mirror my ethics training. I took a lot of ethics classes in undergrad, and I think that's really fascinating. Is you're just really supposed to stick to the facts and present pros and cons, and let your listener decide for themselves
Yeah.
what they think is best or what they want to do. And usually with my clients, they'll ask me at the end, like, well, what do you do? What would you do? What would you feed your pet? And I have a hard time answering that because often have to ask them more questions and well, what's your budget? And
I know there's,
uh,
like, so much more to it than
right.
just,
Yeah.
like, "What's the best way to feed your pet?" I'm like, Wow. What do you
What are
mean?
your risk aversion levels? And do
Yeah,
you
like
want to go by what just the science says versus, or,
I
you know,
know. There's
it's so
so
complicated.
much.
It's hard because what I would
Yeah.
do isn't what everyone else would do and might not even be what's best, even
Or
though
what you're capable of doing,
right, right.
you
And like we've
know?
talked about before, we'd rather have someone on a well formulated, safe, quality kibble than an unbalanced, unsafe, fresh food.
Right.
100% full stop.
Yep.
Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Just keep them on a safe,
Yeah.
quality food
Yep.
rather than experimenting in the fresh space, which fresh is awesome and wonderful. We'll talk about that. But if it's not done well, it's not worth doing. Pet food in general, if it's not done well, it's not worth doing.
Like so many things in life.
Right?
Right?
Exactly. Really, truly is. So, what are some of the pros of conventional science based
Yeah.
kibble?
Um, well, I mean, it's one of the most common forms of feeding for a reason. It typically is the most economical. So the way that it's made, and how it's formed and the ingredients that you need for it, tend to be the, for lack of a better term, cheapest way to make good food. It's also shelf stable. And I think that's such a huge thing that drives owners is, you want something that lasts longer than 2 days in the fridge. Um, I know it's important for me. I have a very busy life and, things go bad in my fridge. So, having something that's shelf stable, which is something also that I think there are aspects of shelf stability that people don't understand. I'll just give an example of, while kibble is typically shelf stable for a very long time, you definitely don't want to put it into individual containers for that amount of time. I think there's been studies, and Danielle, you can, correct me if I'm wrong, on people taking their dog food and putting it in like a big Tupperware container. And then after, say a couple weeks or maybe a month, and they've taken that food, done a test on it, and found that it's actually changed the composition of the food by not being in the bag that it was originally packaged in. So I don't know if this is always true for every single dog food, but it is possible. So while shelf stable is good, we want to really consider how are you storing that food because that also has an impact on the stability of it.
There's a lot of research that goes into how a pet food within each individual company is packaged. Like that packaging is a lot of science, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
expense behind keeping it fresh
Yes.
to show that the nutrients stay preserved for the length of time the food is good for.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely on that one.
Yeah. And then it's also good if you do free feed your cats or dog. It is something that can be left out during the day. So wet food, it's only good for a few hours and then it starts to go bad. And often the animals won't eat it unless you have a lab, then they usually eat everything. Um, but so it's something that if you're going away or, you just leave the food out for your cat, you can do that with this food. Um, and the therapeutic options in this category tend to be a lot more um, numerous as well. So, this is the typical category of where therapeutic foods lie. Um, and it's getting better. The other options are starting to come, companies are coming out with, like the fresh frozen therapeutic foods, and they're starting to follow suit. But most of the therapeutic options are in the conventional science based form.
Yeah, and the therapeutic options too. This is where I often see, and there's the data to back it up, where a pet owner doesn't end up getting on their therapeutic option, or if they do, they're not compliant with continuing to repurchase it. And I think it's because of the way we communicate with pet guardians about therapeutic diets and the importance of needing to emphasize that they're a part of the treatment protocol. They're as important as any of the drugs or prescription medications that the pet is on. If we're sending home with prescription food, then we are sending that it's very, very important. And I hear a lot out there where people will say, or companies especially, will be like, well, there's no drugs in a prescription diet. Prescription diets are pointless and useless. No, they're very important. And they are designed with a specific nutrient profile to help with the treatment of a specific disease process. So they have been researched and studied and developed by experts to help the treatment and management of that disease process. No, there's no drugs in them. There shouldn't be. That's not the point. The point of a therapeutic diet or prescription diet is that they have been formulated with certain nutrients in specific levels to help with the treatment of that disease. And so it's really important to not only feed that particular diet and not go and get something similar sounding over the counter, but feed that
Right.
very specific diet the veterinarian is recommending and sending home with, and also the instructions on it. It's like follow the feeding instructions. Don't just feed the same cups that you were feeding of your regular diet. Follow
Right.
the exact feeding instructions. And that's also veterinarians need to send home feeding instructions with the prescriptions that they are writing. So
Absolutely. I mean,
hopefully that
the
helps.
statement, "Let food be thy medicine,"
Exactly.
is so true, especially in the case of the therapeutic diets.
Yes. Yeah.
It's absolutely a medicine, and as nutritionists, we treat it that way.
Hmm.
If I put a patient or have them on a kidney diet, I respect that diet the same way I'm going to respect a drug.
Hmm.
Not that I don't respect other diets, but you can't just feed some of these therapeutic diets to any pet. Can
Hmm.
be harmful. Just like you can't give any drug to any pet, it could be harmful. So that's why it's very important that there is science behind these, and that's why it falls into this category, because this is where the science typically lies. Even though it's starting to come out in other areas, so that's good. Um, so those are some of the pros of this. I don't know if you can think of any other ones, Danielle, before I move on to the cons.
The quality control and testing generally tends to be higher in these areas, and this is
Mm,
where you'd evaluate a specific pet food.
right.
It's not ubiquitous across the board, but the companies that are really doing it well are doing a lot of quality control and testing in these areas, and that they're doing a lot of testing to make sure what they formulate is actually what's not only going into the bowl but ending up into the pet. So that's
Hmm.
kind of the definition of quality control. So
Right.
generally, a lot of these diets tend to have a little bit more a lot more quality control than some
Right.
of the other options we'll talk
And
about.
and I want to touch too on like the quality control that goes into what you would consider a novel protein or unique protein source.
Hmm.
There's lots of marketing out there like, oh, there's kangaroo or boar or I don't know, all these wild rabbit. Um, and the therapeutic options do much, much, much more behind the formulation and creation and everything of these diets versus over the counter. So that to Danielle's point of, feeding a therapeutic diet and then going to your local pet store and buying the same protein source, it's unlikely you're going to get the same therapeutic effect from that diet because they over the counter just simply does not follow the same rigid quality control and safety protocols that these other diets do.
Yeah,
So,
there have actually been a lot of research looking at novel proteins in general. And if the general rule of thumb is that if a pet needs to be have a diet trial performed to decide if they truly are allergic or not allergic to food, then we find what's called novel protein or just a protein that the pet hasn't been exposed to before and only feed them that for about 12 weeks. And that's it. And if it's food and caused by the food, that should be curing it. And if it's not, then it's something else that's contributing to the disease process and not the food. And so the studies went and looked at over the counter foods. A lot of people will go, oh, I don't want to feed the venison that my vet's prescribing. I want to go just grab the venison diet over the counter. When that venison diet over the counter is probably contaminated with chicken and other ingredients that could be allergenic to that pet. And not necessarily the company's being bad or wrong or intentionally
no.
misleading, but just the way pet food is made, it's messy and maybe the equipment is being quite as thoroughly cleaned between runs, or the air
And
handling
what's
isn't as great. So it's very likely to be contaminated if you're getting something over the counter
yeah.
versus therapeutic. And then we often hear, well, therapeutic diets are more expensive. They are because of the level of quality control that they go through and the extra testing that they go through. That's why they're so much more expensive. And the research, companies got to make up for that cost somehow. And
Hmm.
that's usually where it comes out in the cost. So I just tell clients, okay, you might not be able to afford this diet long term, but how about for the 12 weeks of the trial? Maybe not 12 weeks. How about 8 weeks? Could you do 8 weeks? Could we at least
Yep.
start to see, even 6 weeks? Could we start to see if there's a benefit within the six? Could you afford it for 6 weeks to
Right.
help us get information about yes or no? Is there a diet cause? If there's not, great. You don't have to feed it any longer because we haven't made any difference in 6 weeks. We're not going to make a difference longer. So we can
Right.
stop. And then if they are, and they do have a food sensitivity, we can try to work with them and find something maybe over the counter and really truly dial in on what their pet's allergic to and how allergic they are to it. Because some pets are more sensitive than others. Some even
Mhm.
respond to some of the hydrolyzed chicken diets. They can still pick up,
Yeah.
their body is still picking up on that hydrolyzed chicken, and they can't even be on that. They need to be
Yeah.
on no, where
Yep.
other pets are fine. So every pet's an individual, and quality
Absolutely.
control of the therapeutics matters. Also, safety. These diets tend to be safer than some of the
Mhm.
fresh food options because of the level of quality control and testing that's going on. However, Kibble absolutely has recalls and
Yep.
and bacterial contamination issues, and so companies really also need to be testing Kibble diets to the same level that you would be testing a fresh diet.
Yeah.
Kibble does offer the benefit in that it has a kill step built into it, meaning that the process of
Yeah.
extruding is cooking. So we are killing off most pathogens just within that process itself, but there still should be steps going on after, especially because companies will spray things back on, like certain nutrients that are heat sensitive or light sensitive will get sprayed on, or palatants,
Yeah.
antioxidants will get sprayed on after. And so we still need to test the final product and do a test and hold before sending it out to the client. So yeah, tends to be overall, tends to be safer, not always, but
Yep.
generally.
Um, so the cons. Um, well, one of them is that these tend to be a bit less palatable than other forms of feeding, especially something like raw, home cooked, or fresh food. And that can be a problem if you have a finicky eater. I do often just always like cross my fingers and pray when I have an owner reporting, oh, I have a finicky eater and we need to switch the diet for whatever reason.
Mhm.
um
Sometimes
it's
it's more though, because a lot of these companies do a ton of research on
getting, yeah,
palatants,
so on top of
palatability
that,
enhancers.
tons of money is spent trying to make these palatable, especially from the companies that have a little bit more money. Like they won't release a diet unless it tests a certain palatability level.
Mhm.
So again, just like everything can be, cannot be. Um, the other downside to this is because of the way that it's processed. So, I'll throw out another kind of hot topic word. It's called AGEs, or advanced glycation end products. So people in the house space, they really know about this, and these tend to be from. It's a carcinogen that tends to come from high heat processing, and unfortunately, these kibbles, not all, but some of them have pretty high heat processing in them. And so the theory is that they're higher in AGEs. And that's why some people feel uncomfortable feeding this form of dog food because of the processing level. Go back to talking about their personal beliefs or, their philosophies on nutrition. And this just doesn't meet that. Um, and so, I mean, we could go into what AGs can do to the body. Basically, the underlying thing is it increases inflammation. Um, but that's one of the cons. And then the other con is that there needs to be a fair, decent amount of carbohydrates to produce these kibbles. It's pretty hard to get them low carb just because of the nature of how they're processed. And this can be a little bit troublesome for some feline friends, especially if we got a little bit of a diabetes going on there. So that
And
can
also
also
in that,
be,
if they go grain free, there needs to be a certain amount of carbohydrate in
yes,
the kibble just to hold it into its shape. So
right, right,
inherently, if you're feeding a kibble, it needs to have a certain starch level to
yes,
it to hold that kibble together.
right.
So even if it's grain free, it still potentially could have a
Well, it
lot of
will.
starch in it.
It has to, yeah.
It
It
has
just
to.
has to.
And
To
if that is a concern, it needs to be on a therapeutic diet or a different form of a diet.
Yes, yep.
But really, like with cats and diabetes, the only one we need to really stay away from is the semi-moist. Those ones are formulated usually with like a fructose. So
Yeah.
those would be the one category that like really need would be um, would not want to do for a specific disease process. There's usually options within each one of these categories for everyone.
Right. So speaking of, so we just talked a little bit about kibble, but not only is kibble in the conventional science based category, but also the moist and semi moist products. So in the cans or the pouches, this would also fall under that category. And they are different, obviously, from kibble. They have a much higher water content. So this has pros and cons to that as well. They
You're
also
paying for
tend,
water though,
yeah, yay for water.
and you're paying for it. You're paying a lot of
Oh
money for the
yeah.
water in that product, so that's why they're more expensive.
Exactly. So
They're harder to ship. You pay more for it
yeah,
for
they
the water.
tend
You're paying more for water.
they tend to have more meat products, which animals like. That's why they're a little bit more palatable. So, and they also typically contain higher fat and sodium, which also makes them more yummy. So, those are things you have to also consider when you're on a moist pate or stew, or whatever. Is often people will think that just because they're the same name of the kibble and the wet food, that they have the exact same nutrient profiles. That is rarely the case. I don't know that I've ever actually truly seen something like, maybe a couple, but
Yeah.
really
Yeah, and
most of
that's
the
what I
time.
emphasize more with like the moist and the because I would say it depends on the product, whether it's higher or lower in sodium and phosphorus. It's usually the animal product that makes it more palatable. But what we really need to, in your point, is what we need to watch out for is that they don't match. Even the same company, the same brand, the same food,
Yeah.
the dry and the canned counterpart can have a widely different nutrient profile. And so just
Yes.
something to be aware of for pet guardians is not to just automatically okay, the
Equal.
can is going to have the same fat or the same phosphorus or the same
Yeah.
sodium as the dry. Just you have to look and see, or
Yeah.
have your nutritionist look and
Right.
see.
And it can be confusing for pet owners, and I find this more within the therapeutic realm where they've been prescribed a certain diet. Maybe the pet doesn't want to eat it, so they think, oh well, I'll just feed the wet food. And often when you look at the wet food, you're like, actually you can't, it's too high in sodium or it's too high in fat or whatever. So definitely an important thing to know. They're not interchangeable. This is also so that we talked about the high water content. So really good for those pets if you're kidney pets or something that are really needing to get a little bit extra water. This is often a really good option for them.
Urinary,
Yep,
urinary issues, like
urinary.
stones,
Yep.
fluted. It's a great solution to pollution solution in those patients. So getting them to increase their water intake
Yes.
is the very best thing to do. So it's
Yeah.
a great
Um,
idea for
right.
animals that have urinary issues.
Can you think of any other pros to these?
That's it. That's been
Okay.
covered it.
Okay.
Good job.
So on to the
Yeah.
cons.
Yeah.
Like Danielle said, these foods typically have a lower energy density. And what I mean by that is that they're typically lower in calories per weight. So what does that equal? Tends to equal more expensive because you need to feed more of it to reach those
Mhm.
energy requirements. Um, so it can be cost prohibitive. Um, and you, especially if you have a big dog or something, or even like a Maine Coon or something that needs to eat, three
Yeah,
cans
there's
a
a lot of
day.
cat owners who can't afford to feed exclusively canned, and we shouldn't be
Right.
shaming them
No.
or making them think that they're doing any less of they're any less of a pet guardian towards their cat as someone who's feeding exclusively canned. And that I'd
Oh,
rather
no.
have them feeding a kibble diet and get that cat out of a shelter and not euthanized or not dead, and
Right.
on a kibble diet that is well formulated and safe and balanced, and that
Right.
cat has access to fountains and other devices to help increase their
Yeah,
water intake. So yeah, this whole that
absolutely.
cats should only be on canned and you're a bad cat owner if you don't feed canned, or cats, all the diseases are tied back to kibble and carbs or dry diets is baloney.
No.
Are there maybe health benefits to feeding fresh? Sure, yeah. However, it's expensive, and if it's not done well, it's not worth doing at all. So and the other thing that and this is circling back a little bit to the kibble, is I would say there's safety in the amount of time that we've been using a kibble-based product. Kibble-based products have been
Right.
around for a long time, and
A
there have
great
been
point.
millions and millions of dogs and cats who have been on kibble for their whole lives. And overall, we've done a pretty good job. Dogs and cats are living longer than they
Yeah.
used to. And that's not just nutrition, that's the advancements in health and
Right.
healthcare and science in general that's helping them live longer. But we have a lot of data out there. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of ends. There's a lot of data out there. A lot of cats and dogs who've consumed kibble for a long time. And if it was really as horrible, bad, and awful as some of the people who are fear mongering would make us believe, I think dogs and cats would be dying a lot earlier and
Oh,
sooner
yeah.
than fresh. And once we have all the data out there and available on fresh versus kibble, the expense alone of fresh may be prohibitive for people. So that's when they have to decide on
Yep.
themselves whether or not that's something they can do. And again, if that animal is going to get out of a shelter, it's going to get saved, it's going to still live a great life on a kibble based product. And we don't need to be fear mongering it the way that happens. So,
Absolutely
off my
not.
soapbox.
Yeah.
Please continue.
And then the last point I have here with the cons for these, pâtés and semi-moist or moist foods is they can be stinky
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. So if you're kind of a sensitive person to those things, often I will have clients, and even vet techs and stuff that are like, nope, can't handle the smell.
Can't do it.
Which
Yep.
depending, sometimes that's a really good thing for your pet, so it can be a pro to feeding.
They like the stinky.
They like the stinky, so sometimes, I definitely have products that if I can't get an animal to eat, I'm like, "Oh, we're going for this one because
Reach
it's
for the stank.
smelly," or just
Yeah.
pulling out the tuna and it stinks and they're like they love it. So, I
Do you
put it up there.
remember the treats that I brought into our clinic that we were at together? And
Yes,
it was like meant to be a palatability enhancer topper. It was a treat and it
yep,
was fish based.
yes, and
And
they
it
would
was
stink up the
they were
entire
so
ICU.
stinky. And they were like, Conway, we can't keep doing this. This is stinking up the entire ICU. Yeah, the animals love it, but we're like passing out and gagging because the
Yeah,
entire ICU smells like the Boston Harbor. Like it smells like fish in here. And I laughed and I was like,
but it
oh yeah.
works.
But it works. Like the animals love it, gets them eating. It's a great treat for them. It's
Oh,
super
yeah,
high value and high reward. But to that point, to Kim's point, if the people can't handle it, if they're gagging and can't, we don't want the pet
right,
guardian gagging every time they go to open their
right.
pet's food, or if they're pregnant. I mean, that's a whole nother time is when it just
Nope.
can't happen. Like that could set you off. That could send you to the hospital and cause dehydration because of
Ugh,
the smell and an aroma. So
yeah,
yeah, the
so
stinky can be
can
like
be a
it's a
con.
duality. Yeah, it's a
Yes, it is
duality.
a
It can
duality.
be good, it can be
So,
a con too.
yeah. So Danielle, do you wanna talk a little bit more about the ingredient centric or natural and how that's a bit different?
Yeah, and I would say it's probably the same pros and cons. It just
Yeah.
really depends on the pet guardian's preferences and what they are looking for, what they want. The ingredient centrics are more expensive. They are. And so if that's within
Rightfully
people's
so.
budget and that's important to feeding them, there are absolutely companies within that category. Marine Clinical Nutrition is one that is usually less heard of with pet guardians. It is absolutely an option. And there are others out there as well. And there are some other companies. Merrick is a good one over the counter. That's ingredient centric. Tiki is a good one for cats. That is
They're
more
kinda
ingredient
new. I don't know
centric.
much about tiki, so I'm
Yeah, they've
excited
been
about that.
around in the pet space for a while for over the counter. They just recently launched a veterinary diet.
Mhm.
Um,
Interesting.
and then also Blue, and I know that can be contentious for people, and that they're a marketing company. They put marketing first and got the veterinary professionals involved in after, which they put the cart before the horse, and they're still paying the price for it. Their veterinary diets, I think, are good.
Yes.
And I don't like their marketing of the over the counter and wish they would stop. The whole dog wolf
Duality.
thing, the duality, right? Exactly. So they're overall, I think, a still a company that every company that started is trying to do good. So it's a company that can fire up a lot of veterinary professionals, but I think is worth considering and trying, especially when we have pet guardians that are really wanting that more ingredient centric
Yeah.
option. So I'm grateful to have ingredient centric options out there
Oh,
from
me too,
companies. Yeah,
because
grateful.
that's more my truth is ingredients are important to me. While they're not the
Hmm.
important thing, um, it is important, to consider. Not if you are not into that, that is not a good thing. You're not I'm not vilifying it in any
Yeah.
way.
Just a
Um,
personal preference.
from my personal preference,
Yeah.
like I said, I like the best of both worlds, and so I'm so thankful that while they do tend to be more expensive because they are sourcing their ingredients differently, um, I'm so grateful that they exist.
Let's play a fun game. You just
Okay.
said that, so I think you gave it away. I'm not gonna chime in. I'm not gonna say what I do. But what I'd love to do is at the end of this episode, if
Okay.
anyone's listening, guess. And maybe we could have even a little fun competition or throw in a prize or something for if you can guess what Dr. Conway feeds her puppy,
Like what
Billy
brand
Taco.
or what
Yeah,
type of like what brand of food?
not even brand, just within the
Like
style
what
of feeding.
type?
What do I
Oh,
feed?
so
Yeah,
do okay, let's
yeah,
do it for both of us.
yeah,
Or did I already
yeah.
give it away?
You a little bit, but you can still do it.
Okay.
You can still do it.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's do Doctor
because
let's
you weren't like this is what I do,
right.
blah. Like this is kind of what I like. So let's see if I guessed right. Like
Okay, okay. So
you gave him a hint. You didn't give it away. You gave him a hint.
yes, I did.
Um,
I did. I give you a good hint.
I'm giving a hint. So you
So
can guess what Kim feeds and what category Danielle
that's a fun
feeds
game. I love this. Okay,
to her own
wonderful.
animals. And it might be different for each individual animal in our household.
Ooh.
Yeah. So maybe we can do like a fun little, and we'll get
Okay, so maybe
our
we should say
social
what we
media
have in our
person.
household then, so that people
Yeah.
know. So I
Yep.
have 3 dogs. I have a
Hmm.
Doberman, and she's about 7. I have a 13-year-old Australian Shepherd, and I have a 12-year-old Australian Shepherd Beagle Siberian Husky mix. And I have an 8-year-old Orange Tabby.
Okay.
Okay.
So what does Kim feed each of those? And we can put it in the show notes. We'll put in the
Yeah.
show notes like the animals that we have and
Yeah.
a little bit of their history and a little bit of our household history too, because that factors
Yep.
into it as well. Like, is there anyone immunocompromised in the home and etc. So yeah, we'll put that
Right.
in the show notes
That's
and
fun. I love this. Great
we
idea.
can get our amazing marketing people to help us promote this maybe on social media and do like a fun
Yeah.
little giveaway prize. That could be fun to engage our listeners. Um, yeah.
Okay. Now you go, Danielle.
So now we move on to the fresh category. So that's two big broad categories, right? So we've covered pretty much all of our kind of conventional. Now we're going into people just call it unconventional or what I don't like that. Just fresh versus unconventional, a conventional
Mhm.
versus fresh, not unconventional. Because unconventional, I think, has a negative undertone, and it shouldn't have a negative undertone.
Right. It makes
You're
you
going to
seem
meet people
weird.
at their truth. Yeah. So within that category, it's broad. There's a whole lot in there. So we can have our homemade diets, which could also be commercial. We can have commercial homemade, but they're
Mhm.
still fresh, so they still fall under that mainly fresh category. So those companies,
Yeah.
it's absolutely exploded in popularity, and it's taken off. Um, and so it's gained a lot of popularity. There's a lot of people like ship to your home options, both mostly over the counter for healthy pets, some therapeutic options. And then we have also raw within that category. And raw could be like you make it yourself at home raw, or it could be raw from a company. And even raw from a company, it could be raw that has been safety and tested and AFCO controlled tested and not only quality but safety tested. So there's a whole lot of subcategories even within those categories.
Yeah.
And then we also have our other category, which we'll talk about after. So did you want to kick us off with some of the pros are like, why, Kim, why is home cooking taking off in animals? And it wasn't just a Super Bowl ad. You and I were seeing this even before the Super Bowl ad launched that jerked a million pet owners' tears and appealed to the emotion of pet owners, which I think that ad overall was lovely. And also, I think it was a little bit predatory in that if you talk to people who have a limited budget, they felt really guilty watching that ad. Like, I can't afford this for my pet. Does this mean I'm a
Right.
bad pet owner? And so, if I had been working for that pet food company, or if they've been, I don't work for a pet food company, but if I've been consulted with, or if really any nutritionist had been consulted with the making of that ad, I think a lot of us would have said, hey, let's message us a little bit differently so that we
Yeah.
still appeal to emotion without the level of shaming unintentionally that occurred with that ad. So
Yeah.
I don't like that ad. But this is a popular and growing category. So Kim, why are pet guardians so interested in this? What are some of the pros of it?
There's a good amount of pros, so this is a form that typically you do yourself. You can, like Danielle said, you can have there's commercial companies out there. But a lot of the time when people think home cooked, they think that they're cooking for their pet in their own kitchen. Um, One of the main pros that I think a lot of pet guardians go towards this for is the fact that they can control the ingredients and where they source them and whether they're organic or not. I think we touched a little bit on organic in one of our last episodes on, buzzwords and things around pet food and marketing. But this really, truly is, I think, even the most economical way to get a fully organic meal. If that is something that is important to you, this is probably the route you're going to go down. You can control whether you're buying things on sale, and even where they're sourced from. If you have a butcher that you really trust, or um, a farmer, even that will literally give you their fresh eggs or their freshly killed chickens or beef or whatever. So that's why I think a lot of pet parents or guardians that are, in the health space and really interested in how they source their own ingredients for their own diet, this is really appealing to them. Um, this is also a very palatable option. Um, it's usually whole food ingredients. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat to that. I will say that while it is palatable, you do typically have to add, if you were cooking this at home, a vitamin and mineral balancer. And
Premix.
sometimes this can change the palatability. So I have palatability under the pros, but they're not always more palatable, especially if you have kind of an icky flavored vitamin and mineral mix. And they do exist. So, yeah, they
And that's
can
up to
be.
the individual pet, right? Like the pet,
Yeah.
many of the pets are it's fine, but there's that certain little.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the little toy poodles of the world and the little
Mini
Maltepoos and
Yorkies.
mixes, the little Yorkies. I love you so much,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
it can be a challenge because
Yep.
they are very discerning in their palate.
Yep. And another way, sorry, pro to this is that these diets tend to be a little bit more customizable compared to other forms. So they can be formulated uniquely for your pet based on their preferences, based on any health needs that they have, even based on your preferences. If you have an allergy to a certain food product or just really don't like it, or you really want to include a certain food product, these options can be customizable for that. So that's kind of nice as well. Um, Let's see. It's also a way that some people report that it improves their human animal bond. So we talked a little bit about how food is love to a lot of pet guardians. You feel like when you feed them good food and they like it, that you're showing them that you love them. And in a lot of ways, this is true. Um, and so there has been a study that showed the satisfaction that owners feel when they can cook for their pet. And I think it's similar to like when you cook for your family. Like, I don't know about you, Danielle. Like, I love to cook. And when I make an amazing meal for my family and they all enjoy it, oh, it's like a love language for me. Um,
And
and
you're
so
not
I
even Italian.
think, right. So
Yeah,
I,
food is love, right? Like people really
yeah,
do show their love through food, and
food.
that can feel really good and be important part of the human animal
Right.
bond. It
And
could be
yeah,
preparing the
and
food for the
and
animal.
this way, when you prepare it yourself, it just really connects you. So, I felt like that was an important thing, that was a pro of this way, because scooping out the kibble and putting it in a bowl, I don't think has the same satisfaction as I made this for you. um, and then let's see. think that I'm I'm gonna say one that is, up for discussion. But oftentimes this is viewed with no limitations as one of the best, or I don't want to say best. It's one of the more superior ways to feed your pet for multiple reasons. So, if you've asked a lot of veterinary nutritionists or professionals what the best way is, you might see that this is what they often say. Now, what Danielle and I want to make sure everyone knows is that we don't really subscribe to that in the same way. Um, you know, everything is so, like we've said, subjective to what are your beliefs and all of that. So I wanted to say this in the pros section because I don't want anyone to feel bad when you hear or see other veterinary professionals indicating that this
Yeah,
with no
and I would say it's
limitation.
not nutritionists. Nutritionists aren't gonna go out there and be like, "Fresh is the best and very best," because nutritionists, often spend a lot of their day fixing what goes
Right.
wrong when it goes wrong in a fresh diet. So I think rarely,
Right.
but to your point, I think a lot of, maybe more holistic and integrated veterinary professionals would tell
Right.
you that, kibble is harmful. There's lots of social media influencers out there that are veterinarians that scream at the top of their lungs about how terrible, horrible, and awful
Yeah.
commercial food is, and that fresh is the only way to go, or raw is the only way to go. So, yeah, we don't subscribe to that.
Best is whatever is best for you.
Mhm.
Not whatever some influencer says or
Yeah.
even a veterinary professional, because again, back to the gray zone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, I don't can you think of any other pros, Danielle?
Um, that pretty much covers
Okay.
it. I mean, it is less processed, so it's
Yeah.
lower
Oh, yeah, less
potentially in
processed,
advanced
yes.
glycation and products.
Right.
And a colleague of mine who is a nutritionist and an integrative nutritionist just came up with a paper talking about the categories of processing, because companies will
Oh,
weaponize that and use it as like, we're less processed. Well, what does that even mean? Sometimes it's, there's actually a kibble company out there who's trying to say that they're less processed. What? How?
how?
What?
In
No,
what way?
we're still extruded, or even air dried. Right? People are trying to say that air dried kibble is less processed and better, and it is equivalent to fresh homemade.
Right.
We don't know that, and there's been
No.
some studies to show that the AGEs are maybe even higher in the air dried products, depending on the temperature and how long it's cooked, and we don't know. So, yeah, so we don't know. So, home cooking is a great option. It's got a lot of pros to it, but it also has a ton, a
Con.
ton of
Yeah.
cons, a ton of them. And so, if
Yep.
we're not going to do it right,
I would almost
don't do
argue
it.
there's just as many pros as there are cons for home cooked.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so one of the biggest ones is that often, especially if you're doing it at home, you need to have a veterinary nutritionist, a ho that has a good
Involved
amount of
somehow.
training,
Yeah.
formulate this for you.
Yeah.
So that, depending upon where you go, can make this expensive, not just because you're buying your own ingredients and that tends to be more expensive, but then you also have to pay someone to give you the recipe.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's I would say the biggest deterrent for
Yeah.
why people don't go this route. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing is, if
And
you don't go that route, the chance of the recipe that you're getting potentially from an influencer online or wherever, it's a very high chance that it is an unbalanced diet. They've done studies to confirm this. They've gone online and taken random
mhm.
diets, cooked them, made them, and tested what the nutrient balance was, or even just ran it through a formulator, as simple as that. And I think it's something astronomical. Like 95% of these diets are
Yeah.
unbalanced if you just are getting them off the internet.
Hmm.
So that can be really dangerous.
Yeah, and also to
um,
pause there a little bit and flush that out is you'll hear a lot of influencers, even veterinarians, that will say, "Oh, it shouldn't be that complicated. Making you don't need a nutritionist. It's not that complicated," or "We don't necessarily need to be formulating to a spreadsheet," or what are the other things I've heard?
yes, they
The
do.
numbers don't necessarily matter. Yes, they do.
They
For maybe
absolutely
not for
do.
all pets, and you certainly pets and people, we have a spectrum to which we can operate from, and the living beings are very resilient, and there's conditions to which we can exist that aren't optimal, and cats less so. That's why cats have so many more specific requirements than dogs. But this notion that we don't need to be having nutritionists involved, that like even just there's a program that teaches GP vets how to formulate homemade diets for sick pets. I think they could do home cooked for well animals, but there's a lot of nuance to the ingredients and fiber and the bioavailability and the different forms of the vitamins and minerals, and that's complicated and really does require advanced training that you
Oh
don't get in veterinary school, and that these courses aren't teaching as well because there aren't nutritionists involved on a day-to-day basis with them. So just be wary of that, and
yeah.
that, and then when they say it doesn't matter and it doesn't balance doesn't matter, let's be real here. Nutritionists wouldn't have a job
If it didn't matter.
if it didn't matter. I wish that wasn't part of my job. I wish there wasn't the demand to fix the animals that had been messed up and made sick and unhealthy because of unbalanced diets, or diets that, homemade or commercial, that aren't doing the quality control and aren't well formulated as they should be. It's so preventable that it drives me, I, I lose
Yep.
sleep at night,
No,
looking at these
I
people saying it
agree.
doesn't matter. Because every day of a nutritionist life, not just mine, ask anyone,
Yep.
and also the veterinary public, how many issues are we treating? And my issue is that these other courses, they're not teaching these individuals, these fake canine nutritionists, what nutrient deficiencies look like. I know I paid to take the courses and like pulled my hair out the entire time and how bad and inaccurate they are.
Glutton
They
for
aren't teaching
punishment.
them how to look what these nutrient deficiencies look for. So yeah, it's very easy to get up there and say, "Oh, it's fine. You don't need the balance. These aren't real. They're just on the spreadsheets. They're on the number." They wouldn't know what a nutrient deficiency looked like if it jumped up and bit them in the
Hmm.
buttocks.
Yep.
They wouldn't. They're not trained. They have no idea. So how many of their patients or their clients, whatever they call it, are walking around with nutrient deficiencies that eventually lead to very serious diseases because they didn't see it and they didn't know what to look for?
And
Hard truth.
oftentimes too, sometimes they're not even drawn back to the diet. Like they even
Oh
some
no.
other vets, they don't even
Blind
know
to
the
it.
nutrient deficiency signs. And
Mhm.
so it's not even on the like top of their radar. They're starting to test them for other disease processes that are maybe
Mhm.
looking similar to this when
Mhm.
it's their diet that needs to be looked at. And that's the other
I'm
side of it
Yep. I'm
is
part
it.
of several groups for that promote fresh whole feeding, and clinicians will come together to share their cases. I can't tell you how many of them I look at and go, "That's a nutrient deficiency." Or, "Have you
Yeah.
considered a zinc deficiency? Have you considered copper? What's this animal eating? Who
Yes.
formulated it? This looks like a
Yes.
zinc deficiency to me. This looks like a B vitamin deficiency. This looks like, have you ruled out copper?" And
Yes.
they're like, "What? What?"
Yeah. It's almost
And
like
almost always they're on an unbalanced fresh food diet. So, how
yeah.
many of these animals are walking around with diseases that are so preventable because of the spread of misinformation?
Yep. And how much money are these owners spending on unnecessary diagnostics because the veterinarians don't know how to look for these nutrient deficiencies or even, think of them. And that's
And
not
on
to
these
say that it's
expensive foods, right?
right.
Like they're spending all this money on these expensive foods, thinking they're doing the best thing for their pet when they're actually causing more harm than they are
Yeah.
doing good.
Yeah. And this
My heart goes
and
out
the
to
other,
them.
like, side to it that my heart just, like, goes out to them is, like, I don't know that there's very many pet owners out there that know what they're doing and don't care. They think that what they're
Yeah.
doing is the best thing for their pet, and because of whether they've gotten poor information or, they just don't have access to the information, if you just educate them, they're happy to change what they're doing. Like there's I that's sometimes what breaks my heart is most of the time these pet guardians, their heart is in the right place and what they were misled and think they're doing something great for their pet and it turns out that they actually harmed their pet, and that's where
Mhm.
my heart breaks is because no one ever wanted to do that.
And
Um
how many times did people walk into our exam room and say, "Oh my God, I wish I found you sooner"?
oh,
How many times did we hear that?
every single consult.
Every single consult of every single day.
And think of what if we just had a little bit more nutritional training or focus in the veterinary space. Think of how many animals and pet owners we could influence and improve their lives on with just a little
Hmm.
bit more knowledge out there.
Yep.
It,
Meeting more people at their truth in a way that
yeah.
also aligns with the greater scientific consensus and isn't just
Yeah.
spreading misinformation.
Yeah.
And that's
Anyway, we
all.
digress.
Yeah. Well, we're
What are
still in the cons. We're
yes,
still within the
we're still in the
cons.
cons.
And with the yeah,
So
we're still in the cons of the homemade diet. So we need the nutritionist to formulate, tying it back in. There's a high chance of it being imbalanced. There's studies to back this up.
yep,
The variety does not equal balance. I
no.
think we've beaten that dead horse
Yeah.
quite a bit.
Yes.
There's definitely a high chance of dietary drift. Kim, do you want to talk about
Yeah, I'm gonna talk
what the
about this.
heck is
So
dietary drift in
dietary
homemade
drift.
diet?
So what that means is you go to a nutritionist, you get this great recipe, and you're a little bit creative in the kitchen and decide to maybe, oh, I'm not going to do green beans today. I'm going to do broccoli. Maybe Fluffy likes broccoli. This is what we call a recipe drift. People believe that they do something pretty similar. It's a vegetable, it's green, or they do yellow beans instead of green beans, and they kind of drift from the recipe. And what happens when you do that? It becomes unbalanced because you're now using a completely different food source. Now, there are instances where you can interchange things, I believe, if right, Danielle, that there are
Mhm.
some things where you can use
Yeah,
this kind of
depends on the pet,
squash.
right? Yep, depends
Yeah,
on what they need and what their nutrients of
but
concern are and
that
what
will
the
be
ingredient is.
indicated,
Some you can. Yep,
right? That
yep,
will be indicated in
yep.
the recipe.
Mhm.
Most nutritionists, if you can do any kind of ingredient swap, they will tell you exactly which
Yep.
ones you can do. If there is no indication for it, don't do it, or you got to call them and ask if you can do something like
Uh-huh.
this. Now,
I liken drift to the game of telephone. Like, did everybody
yeah,
played that game when
yeah,
you were a kid where you
yeah, yeah,
have a
yeah,
story and then you
yeah,
whisper it in someone's ear, and then the more that story is told, the further away it gets from the original
right,
story. That absolutely has been shown to happen, validated by science with homemade diets or even commercial diets if we don't have a nutritionist involved and qualified people involved, where every time that diet gets made, ingredients get swapped, to Kim's point about the ingredient swap, or not measured as accurately,
right,
or we get comfortable, we sometimes get a little sloppy, we not even sloppy, we try to find a ways to streamline our life and make our life easier, because
yeah,
life is hard and who isn't looking for ways to make their life easier. And so it's really important to have those rechecks frequently if someone is on a homemade diet, to make sure that they're not, like, when I liken this to, I have a slip disc or SI issues in my back. And when I'm at the physical therapist, I know I'm a compliant client. Like, right, most of our clients are very compliant that are going to spend the money to come talk to a nutritionist.
yes,
And I go home and I do what I think are my exercises. And I think I'm doing them so well. And then I go back in to see my physical therapist and like, yeah, you're cheating. I'm like, no, no, I'm not. I'm trying so hard. They're like, no, no. See,
right,
your feet are slipping. I'm like, no, they're not. And they're like, okay, look where your feet are now at the end of your reps. And I'm like, oh, so that's exactly what's happening at home
right,
with the homemade diet and pet owners. And it's, even though they want to be compliant, they think they're being compliant,
yeah,
you need someone checking your form, right? Like with a physical therapist or personal
yeah,
trainer, you need to check in. You need to make sure that that form is being checked in the
yes,
techniques of making
and
the homemade diet.
it's so common, even, like, just perception, like, I'll just give an example. My sister was doing a homemade diet for a dog she was babysitting, and, of course, she was talking to me about it, and, she bought a butternut squash instead of a zucchini because the instructions were summer squash versus winter squash, and so she kinda misinterpreted that, and she's like, just going over the ingredients and what she bought with me, and she's like, "So this one says summer squash, but I just got a butternut squash." And I was like, "No." And she's like, "Why? It's a
Mm-mm.
squash." I like, just perceptions even down to people, like, they literally think
Yeah.
some ingredients are the same
Yep.
thing.
A butternut squash is more like a sweet potato than it is a summer squash, like a
Right.
zucchini. A cucumber is more closer to a summer squash than a butternut squash is.
Exactly. but some
Yeah.
people just don't know these
Yeah.
things. And so
Well,
the recipe
yeah.
drift can happen purely based on just their perception of what
Yep.
ingredients are. Like squash is
Mhm.
squash to them. It doesn't really matter. Um, and so yeah, just things like that. But anyway, moving on. So another con is if these recipes are formulated for medical reasons, sometimes you can have some issues sourcing ingredients. So I'm going to use a novel protein as an example. So say your pet needs to be on something like rabbit, or let's see what's another good, venison. You may find a source that is good, but then they may run out and you're kind of stuck because you can't really go to the grocery store and buy venison and rabbit.
Mhm.
So that can sometimes be a con as well. If you have really particular ingredients that need to be in these diets, you may have a really hard time sourcing them. So that's a hard thing. And then the other thing is that these can often be difficult to travel with. So if you're someone who likes to go camping or travels for days on end, because these tend to be fresh, or then you can freeze them for a bit. Once they're thawed, they only have a couple days in the fridge. And so if you're traveling for long periods, it's really hard to feed this way unless you are
Mhm.
cooking the meal wherever you are fresh every single day. Which is very difficult to do because most of the time these are done in batches. We usually give a pretty big quantity and then you can divide it up to feed your pets. So you're not cooking fresh every single day. But some people do it. Some
Yep.
people do it, and it is possible, but that does
Yep.
tend to be a con where, people don't want to cook 2 meals a day fresh, like cook one meal in the morning,
Yeah.
cook one meal
And
at
you
night.
can use home cooked as like a canned food. You don't have to use that homemade food exclusively. And the nice thing about it is you could even use it as a food topper without having to worry about unbalancing the diet. So if
Right.
clients that can't afford to do the 100% homemade, maybe we're getting the animal a little bit closer to the nutrient profile we're looking for that disease. We're not perfect, but we're better than where we started, right? We're
Yep.
meeting halfway a little bit, and that can make it easier to travel with too. So often we'll try to come up with a backup to the homemade for people when they need to travel, when someone's going to be watching the animal, or if God forbid that pet ever ends up, the person who prepares the food ever ends up ill or in the hospital and can't prepare the food for that animal, that there's a backup plan for
Yeah.
what to do that doesn't result in calling their nutritionist at 2 a.m. in a panic,
Yeah.
asking them immediately what to do. Because
Yep.
um, yeah, so having the backup plan is important, and there's workaround to all these cons. And that's the other thing is, I almost don't like calling them cons. We say pros and cons, and when I present it, I instead of calling them cons, I call them opportunities or challenges
Okay.
because they're not necessarily
Well, because
they're
some
not
of them are
a reason
cons, but
not
it
to do it,
depends
right?
on your perception. Like the
Exactly.
stinky
Yeah.
thing, like,
Yeah.
that can be a con to somebody, but it could also be, like, a pro to
Yep.
another pet owner who has a
Mhm.
finicky animal, and they're like, "I
Yep.
just want the stinkiest food that you have." That's a pro.
Yeah. So just
So
wanted to just take a second to highlight that, and that even though we're presenting it as a con, it could be perceived as a pro,
yeah,
and it isn't necessarily a reason not to do something. Like people often say, like, it's a con, as in don't do it. Like, no, we're not saying as in don't do it. We're saying be aware. These are things
and
to be aware of. There are ways to
right,
overcome them. We wouldn't even be presenting a food category here if we didn't think it wasn't
suitable, or a
suitable, or
very
we would flat out
a
say it. Yeah.
fine way to feed
Right.
your animal.
Yeah. Yep.
There's 2 sides to every coin.
Mhm.
And that's how we're presenting it. Yeah, you're right. Pros and cons can have negative connotations. It's just, yeah, well said. All right, what's the next one? This one's kind of a hot topic, and um, I like this category, so take
Yeah.
it away.
So this one, I almost feel like we could make this its own whole separate episode.
And I think we should.
Um,
I
yeah.
think we should eventually.
Yeah. Do a whole separate episode. So raw. And again, we have raw. You got to ask the person. So if an owner comes in to the clinic, first we ask, what exactly are you doing? Because raw can mean very, very different things. Are there ways to do raw where we can mitigate the cons or mitigate the risk? Yeah. And it really just all comes down to how risk adverse the client is. And I believe that our
Yeah.
clients should be Our job as medical professionals are to present the risks and the
Yeah.
pros and cons of the different options and the costs, and then let people decide. It's called informed consent. You can actually get in
Yes.
really big trouble for not doing this now, is not
Yeah.
giving people informed consent and letting them know about the side effects of the even medications or procedures or supplements. Everything in life has a risk,
Sometimes
right?
even the
Like,
pros and the positives to some of these things, and for me, this is a little bit of a thing that bothers me because I'm pregnant, and it seems, that there are times where you're only presented with the negative side, and
yeah.
you're not
Mhm.
presented with what's the positive side if I
Right.
don't do this. Because sometimes there are positive sides to not doing something, um,
Oh, for
or
sure.
positive sides to doing something, and caretakers or practitioners
Or
will
things
withhold that
where,
information trying to manipulate
yep.
an answer, and that happens a lot, I do think, in veterinary veterinary medicine, because they don't feel comfortable with your choices, so they're gonna withhold information from you so that, you know, you choose what they are comfortable with.
Or for, generosity of assumptions. I think it's that they're afraid. They don't want to get
Yeah.
sued. They don't want to cause harm. And if
Yeah.
they don't, and nutrition is not something that is well taught across the board in all veterinary schools. There are some veterinary schools that do an incredible job
Right.
and have functional and amazing clinical nutrition services. Unfortunately, not all of them are. And I think, pet consumers, I would love it to start put more pressure on veterinary schools to have functional clinical nutrition services, or be consulting with nutritionists that are can come in and give more non-branded nutrition educations, because I think not having these conversations with clients is doing more harm than good. And
Yep.
I do wish that my colleagues, who maybe they're not comfortable talking about raw, maybe they're not comfortable recommending raw, at least send them to me, right? Send them to us, send them
Right.
to us, who will help
But
them, help talk to the
you're not
client about how to mitigate that risk,
you're not the end of the
because they're
road,
going to do it anyway. Yep.
right? Like,
And then,
there's always
yep, they're
gonna
going
be
to.
someone where you can send them somewhere, and that's part of your due diligence, in my opinion, as a
Mhm,
practitioner or a vet or a tech or whatever. Like, you don't have to know all the answers, but it is a bit of your responsibility to be able to send those
mhm,
people, those clients, to someone who does.
mhm.
And I think that
To
sometimes that's
discuss
a
the
step that's missed, is that
pros and cons and risks,
yeah,
and ask, is there anyone immunocompromised in the home? Is this animal on chemotherapy? Are any of the other dogs in the home on chemotherapy?
right,
Is there an immunocompromised person in the home? Are there really young children in the home? So a home that, my youngest child would like to literally bathe in the dog water and would lick the dog food bowls. And that scared me, because even
yep,
kibble can be very contaminated. And so, um, but maybe that's not the
mhm,
best environment, because there's going to be a risk, right? It's a young child licking the,
yeah,
maybe, maybe not, but that's up to the family to make that informed
right,
consent. And so telling them that there's no risk, no issue, that's not accurate,
right,
and not fair to them. So they need
mhm,
to be able to decide. And one of my favorite anecdotes before we wrap up here is, I had an immunology professor. His name is Ron Schultz, and he's like world renowned in veterinary immunology. And he's actually the godfather of the 5-year rabies vaccine. And the reason why we went from 1 year to 5 years, because of the research he did out of the University of Wisconsin.
oh, wow,
And so people would always ask him, because he would lecture worldwide on immunology. Okay, well, Dr. Schultz, what do you vaccinate your pets for? And I had the fortune of hearing him say this multiple times to different groups of people, whether it was pet owners, because breed clubs would ask him, and
right,
performance groups and veterinary professionals. Everyone's asking him, like, what to do, because that's a whole other contentious area, is like vaccination, right? Not only in humans, but in pets. Well,
yep,
Dr. Schultz, what do you vaccinate your pets for? And he goes, I'm not going to answer that directly. I'm going to answer that indirectly, in telling you that I am not, I am a not risk averse person. He said, I fly planes, I drive a motorcycle, and I live a life that most people would consider pretty risky. I engage in high risk activities and behaviors. And so, what I choose to do for my own animals at home, it's very different from your risk tolerance level and what you may do at home, or more so what your clients may do at home. So, you really need to just give them the pros and the cons and the risks of
right,
doing and not doing. Like, what happens if you do it? What happens if you don't do it? And what's the likelihood of that happening? And let
yep.
them decide. or even simply saying we don't know. Like it seems low, but when it happens, it's life threatening. Like with raw,
And
like with
right. And
not
what's
that's
the
been safety tested.
like your I will just use the vaccine at like example, but like
Hmm.
someone could view not vaccinating their kids or pets as a very high risk, and someone could view vaccinating them as a very high risk. So even the
Hmm.
perception of what is the topic of risk is very different. So he says
Right.
that, but like the thing that I like about that statement is I don't know which way he's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And so that's a great answer.
Yep.
Um, because I would also concur that I live a very high risk life, and so I'm gonna use that.
Mhm, yeah,
No,
it's a great that's what I say
that's
it
a good
all the
answer.
time to people who are especially the people that come to me because I get a lot of clients that come to me because I'm not all nutritionists will talk about raw, not all veterinary professionals will talk about raw because of
Right.
the way we've been traumatized, right? Like it's
Yeah.
because of how we've been traumatized because all of these
Well,
we end up dealing with the sick and injured and like the result of the things that go bad, right? So
and it
there's a
tends
reason why
yeah, and it
vet
tends to
professionals are
be
traumatized.
dogmatic from both sides.
Oh, totally.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
I would
and
say
we
it's
we
the
can do
most
it.
dogmatic out of all of the feeding options
Mhm.
is raw. If you're a vet, it's a lot of them are very far on one side, and if you are someone who supports raw, you are very far on the other side.
Yep.
Raw tends to have the least amount of gray, and that's
Mhm.
why no one wants to touch it with a 10-foot
Yeah.
pole because not only, are they like maybe going to have a difference of opinion, but it seems that if you do, you really piss off the other side.
Mhm.
It's
Yep.
not kind of just
And there
like,
can be
eh.
gray.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
there's
very it tends to be black and white, but there
from
is gray even within the
our
raw food.
perspective, there's gray.
Yes, exactly, and we'll do a whole episode
Yeah,
on if you wanna learn more about raw food feeding and how to minimize the risk. If you're interested in it, we'll do a little baby deep dive into advanced glycation end products 'cause like I said,
yeah.
it's something that I did
I think that's a
research
good
in,
idea.
we could go hog wild and talk about that too.
Yeah,
So we will get more to be continued. We will get more into raw, but I think in the time being just needs to be aware of there's a risk. There's a risk to all of these categories. Your dog can get sick and or cat and can drop dead from eating any one of these foods if there's a major issue with them. That's I think why that quality control and the company is so
yeah,
important and holding them
yeah.
accountable is so important.
And we'll
And
also
there's
do an episode on how to pick a good pet food company and what
yes,
qualities to look for.
yep,
So, stay tuned for that.
yeah. We
Um
won't tell you which company to feed.
No, 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 just on what are certain things that us as nutritionists and a dietitian,
Yes,
look
we're
for
looking for.
when
Yeah.
maybe someone brings a company to us that we've never heard of. What do
When
we
we do
look
that, you
for?
know what the most common question is gonna be or the
Yeah,
comment underneath the feed, it's gonna be, "Well, which companies? Well, which companies? Well, which
yeah.
companies? Well, which
No,
companies?" It's like,
where
this you gotta do
while
your
we
own
name
legwork
drop a
on.
little bit, we
Yeah,
really don't
yeah.
we try really hard to
No,
stay
we
neutral.
can't because we don't work for them either,
No,
right?
we
Like,
don't.
I don't work for any pet food company. I have no and even if we did, we don't have any control over them,
Oh
right?
god,
Even if
no.
we did, we have no control over what that company does or
We don't
doesn't
own a
do,
pet food
and
company.
right.
Yeah,
So, like even if a company is amazing today, and some companies we've name dropped could be amazing right now, and that is a caveat that even if we've name dropped anywhere in our episodes, don't assume if you're listening to this
that we
a
support
month
them.
later, a year later, 10 years
Yeah,
later, that it's still a company that we would be recommending. We don't know because we're ultimately not in control of it, and that's why we do try to kind of limit name dropping
yeah.
because of
So,
that reason. Yeah.
anyway, such a
Yep.
pleasure as always.
Yes.
And I hope you have. We're recording on the weekend, so I hope you have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. And we'll be posted. We'll do a little, that friendly competition.
Yeah.
So in thinking about these categories, and there's actually a whole other category called other, which is freeze dried dehydrated, which kind of falls though into the same pros and cons, I would say, as some of the diet options that we've talked about. But we could maybe pull that out
Yeah.
and do a whole episode just talking about other types of options, what they are, what are some things to look for, safety, quality, et cetera, if
Yep.
clients are interested in doing those. And yeah, so based on what you've heard, what do you think that Kim and I feed our own animals?
Ooh.
Yeah. Happy
All right.
feeding.